very appreciative audience. Thank you. I notice that all the time everybody's very happy here. It follows me everywhere. This. So anyway, thank you, Adam. So I was just in Poznan. I don't know, 2 days ago, 3 days ago. There was the. I think you had something here in Wrocław also to celebrate the centenary of the publication of the Polish peasant in Europe and America, a book written by W.I. Thomas and Znaniecki, Florian Znaniecki. Am I correct? Was there some sort of seminar here too? No?
There was in Lower Silesia University. Last month, yes.
Okay. So anyway, so I don't know if you read the works of Znaniecki, but anyway, this book, The Polish Peasant, is a very famous book. It's the beginning of a very famous school of sociology in Chicago, the Chicago School of Sociology. And the book was published, well, it actually had 5 volumes. And it was published between 1918 and 1920. Anyway, so I want to say something about that book, and I want to compare Znaniecki's contributions to US sociology and global sociology with those of another Pole, Bronisław Malinowski. And I don't know if people read Malinowski here, but Malinowski was a very, very important figure in British social anthropology. In fact, he really began British social anthropology. Do people read Malinowski? Yeah, no, you do, but has anybody else? No? Okay. Well, this introduction is going to be a comparison of the two and the schools of sociology that they developed, and then I'm going to talk about the extended case method as a conversation I am having with these two different schools, the anthropology and the sociology. So we'll see how it works. Okay. So this is, in case you're wondering, this is your Polish Znaniecki. He looks like a very, very severe man. He's not somebody you would want to invite to your home, probably. Anyway, he's very severe, but a very, very famous figure in Polish sociology and in world sociology. And this is his collaborator, W.I. Thomas. And down here, I don't know if you can see at the back, but this gentleman here is actually Malinowski, and he is talking to the people he studies in Melanesia, the Tobrian Islanders. And you can see that he's very colonial in his approach. He's all in white, and he is talking to these naked natives. So it represents the characteristic of old-style anthropology. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about these two people. Okay, let's see if this works. A Tale of Two Poles. Actually, in English, there's a play on the word poles, but anyway, leave that alone. So this is Florian Znaniecki, born 1882. 1958 is when he died. He had a very interesting early career when he was a student like you. He was a very rebellious student. He protested against the Russian occupation of Poland, and he was expelled from the university. That's a good example. So then he left Poland. He went to Switzerland, to France, and he eventually got a PhD in Krakow. But when he was in Europe, he spent much time in France, actually listening to lectures by such people as Emile Durkheim, very famous sociologist who you may have to read. In 1913, this fellow W.I. Thomas, American sociologist, also a very adventurous sociologist, who eventually, in about 1918, 1919, W.I. Thomas was fired from his job. He lost his job because he was sleeping with another man's wife. In those days, apparently, this was not acceptable. Today, this is perhaps normal. Anyway, I don't know. But anyway, Thomas is a very colourful figure in American sociology, and he collaborated with Scientiae to write The Polish Peasant. Now, The Polish Peasant is 2,000 pages long. 2,000 pages long in English, probably the same in Polish. And it's basically a story of the relationship between the Poles who migrated to Chicago and the families that they left behind in Poland. But actually, The Polish Peasant, the book, has 2 volumes. The first volume is about Poland, and indeed, very interestingly, it is about the Polish peasant in Poland and also the relationship of the Polish peasant to the Russian occupation. It actually anticipates much anthropology later on today about the significance of colonialism for rural peasant life. That's the Polish story. The American story is the Polish peasant in Chicago working in many of the factories, the food processing industry in Chicago, and how they develop their community there. And he uses the ideas of disorganization and reorganization to actually understand the life of the Polish peasant in Chicago. What I want to emphasize is that this is a global ethnography. It's based in first about letters that were transmitted between Poland and the United States. So the people were examining the letters, so this is your methodological thing, that actually this famous book was largely based on letters, but also on newspapers and on public records. They did not believe that interviewing was a good way to do research in those days. So better rely on the spontaneous letters and public records. So it was a global ethnography in the sense that it connected life in Poland with life in Chicago. Transnational. Very rare. So, a very significant monograph. So, anyway, there's a significance that after Polish Peasant was written, Scientiae came back to Poland and established sociology, the first sociology department in Poznan. And he established sociology in Poznan from 1920 to 1939. And then he returned to the United States. What often happened with Scientiae, he would go to the United States for a visit, and then the war would break out, First World War, then Second World War, and he was stuck in the United States and couldn't come back. So he actually ended up spending a lot of his later time in the United States and became president of the American Sociological Association. Anyway, it's a very significant figure. And when I was at this conference 2 days ago in Poznan, I learned a lot about the writings of Scientiae after the Polish Peasant. Again, very interesting. He began as a philosopher and then became a sort of sociologist. So I don't know if do you read Scientiae?
Of course. Yes.
Of course. Well, that's good to know. All right. Do you read Scientiae? Silence. All right. I won't punish you. Okay. I spend a lot of, when I teach in the University of California in Berkeley, it's where I come from, I always punish students if they don't say anything, but I'm not going to punish you. Okay, now, that is Florian Scientiae. Now, Bronislaw Malinowski, actually born almost at the same time, and died much earlier. He got his PhD from Krakow in philosophy, as everybody did then, and then decided, no, actually, he got his PhD in physical sciences. He was a physical scientist. He got interested in anthropology, went to the London School of Economics in 1910, and then did his PhD in anthropology, and then did his field work in New Guinea, which is near Australia, and then Melanesia. And his work amongst the Trobriand Islanders became very famous, and is still famous to this day, like the Polish Peasant. And wrote this book, The Argonauts of the Western Pacific. That was his first major work in 1922. But most importantly, he actually founded the School of British Social Anthropology. That in fact, many of the most famous anthropologists in England were his students. People like Evans Pritchard, Fortis Brown, Hortense Powdermaker, Audrey Richards. These are very famous anthropologists who were his students. He actually became a major figure in the intellectual landscape in the United Kingdom. So all I'm saying is that these two Poles, actually, these two Polish social scientists, were very influential in the shaping of, on the one hand, sociology, and on the other hand, anthropology. Okay. Now, I have a point to make about these two characters. A tale of two Poles, right. So what Scientiae and Thomas do in the Polish Peasant, as I said, they do a global study. They connect what's going on in the lived experiences in Poland of the peasants and link it to the lives in Chicago. Very unusual global perspective. And what happens after that in the Chicago School of Sociology, a very famous school in the United States, is that it becomes much more confined. The Chicago School actually begins to focus not on global movement of migrants, but on what happens in Chicago itself, in the different communities. So it becomes a study of metropolitan Chicago, and the global context gets suspended and disappears from the analysis. You get a study of communities in Chicago, and finally, even worse, it actually gets confined to the study of what happens within organizations. You can't see that, can you? What shall we do?
Oh, I just moved this. What? It stopped?
No, everything is fine. This code is in the way.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Anyway, so what happens to the Chicago School? They begin to study organizations and institutions. That's mine. Alright. Okay, so what happens to Chicago School gets narrower and narrower and narrower. So they begin to study factories as though there was nothing outside the factory, as if it was an isolated village. They begin to study asylums. There's a fellow called Erling Goffman, very famous sociologist, and he actually basically studies social interaction in very confined places. Anyway, it's a sort of narrowing of the sociological project. Now, if you look at anthropology, and here I'm going to start with Malinowski, who actually, he is very critical of the ideas, implicitly, not explicitly, of Scientiae and Thomas, because behind Scientiae and Thomas is an idea of modernization, that moving from the Polish peasant in Poland to Chicago is the development of modernization. It's a theory of modernity. It is a theory of the natural evolution of societies. Malinowski didn't believe in this theory, and he said it's much more important to actually study the detailed life experiences of people in different countries, but particularly in small-scale societies. And he was one of the first, he is a pioneer of field work, what we call ethnography today, in which the social scientist, anthropologist, goes and joins those that they study in their lives. So Malinowski sits in the village for 2-3 years, studying how people relate to one another, the rituals in which they engage, how they exchange things among themselves. But of course he's doing this as a white man studying these natives. And there's today we are very we find this a very problematic relationship. But Malinowski was important for the detailed analysis of the day-to-day life of people in Melanesia. So, what happens to anthropology is very interesting. It moves in the other direction. There's another famous school of social anthropology in England. These are people who go and study Africa, Central Africa, Southern Africa, and they see that when they study people in villages like Malinowski, that many of the villages are migrating to the mining industry in South Africa and in Zambia and in Zimbabwe. And they see that you cannot isolate the village, as Malinowski did, that you have to look at the broader field. And when these anthropologists leave the village and go to town, they have to think about relations in new ways. When you go to town, you cannot confine, they argued, they cannot confine the communities to some isolated entity, but you have to see the communities in relationship to other communities. So they began to develop an alternative way of doing field work by what they call the extended case method. That they recognize that what happens in the community is shaped by forces beyond the community. Yes, so this was, Malinowski didn't see the world that way. He isolated his village, but the Manchester School sort of put the village, put the town, put the community in its wider context. And the next step is for anthropology to become global. Today, anthropology has a much more global vision. It is interesting that anthropology today rejects its founders, rejects Malinowski, Evans, Pritchard, Fortisbaum, because they did not see the colonial order that made possible their studies. So the studies in Melanesia, the studies in Africa, relied upon the entry of the anthropologist into the field, into the community, by virtue of the colonial administration. But they, in their studies, they ignored the colonial administration. And today anthropologists say you cannot ignore colonialism. In fact, anthropology is shaped by, as it was, by the colonial order. And so we now get post-colonial studies that actually try and look at the global relations among communities. So what I'm trying to say is that where Scientiae led to the narrowing of research in the Chicago School, Malinowski set the foundation for a broadening, for an ever greater broadening of anthropology. Well, let me just say this. In my work, I have had a sort of an argument with both the Manchester School and the Chicago School. And that's where I enter. And I enter with a development of this idea of the extended case method, which is what I'm going to talk about for the rest of my time. Now, are there any questions about what I have said so far? Definitely not from you, sir. Okay. Any questions? Any questions? Wow, silence. Okay, let's go. No. I don't know if this all makes any sense to you, but let me try. That was part one. Now we're going to move to part two, which is what I was supposed to talk about. And I'll see if I can explain to you this whole extended case method. So what I'm going to argue is the Manchester School was doing something very important in linking communities to the wider context. The Chicago School is the enemy from my point of view, because they did not actually see that the communities they studied in Chicago were shaped by broader forces. So they would study a community and they would find you know, in Chicago, they would find that there were the railway tracks, and then there was a park, and then there was a school, and then these sort of physical boundaries shaped the community, and they were not interested in what went on beyond that community. I think that is deeply problematic. It is very troubling that they couldn't see the wider world. And so my criticism of the Chicago school is that you have to look at the wider context that is shaping the macro, micro, small-scale relations. The relations in this room between you and me are not shaped just by our presence here, but by forces. I come all the way from California with these strange and ridiculous ideas, and you look at me blankly, not knowing what I'm talking about, because you come from a completely different tradition. You can't understand our relationship, or even the relationship among yourselves, because some of you here are international students, some are Polish students. All the relations in this room cannot be understood by just looking at this room. You have to go beyond this room. You're still looking at me blankly. All right. Anyway, that's my point. That's the basic idea of what I'm going to have to tell you. And the second thing I'm going to have to tell you is I'm going to understand the relations that are shaping what is going on in this room. I have to know what forces beyond the room to look for. And for that, I need some sort of framework, some sort of theoretical framework, some sense of what are the important forces in the world shaping what is going on here. So you're going to need to move beyond the micro to the more broader macro forces, and to do that you need theory. All right. Extended case method. Now I'm going to repeat what I've just said. I think repetition is always very good. Okay, there are 4 points to the extended case method. The first 2 are very uncontroversial, not controversial. The first is that you extend in this method of doing field work. But basically it is a way in which to study the world. You join the people you study in their space and their time. Like Malinowski goes into the villages in the Trobriand Islands. And that W.I. Thomas, well, no, let's leave him out. But basically the ethnographic approach is that you join, as the observer, you join the people in their lives. I mean, I don't know how you do research here, but Poland is very famous for its social surveys, and in which you take somebody out of their context and you ask them questions. And then you don't know why they answer the questions the way they do, because actually the answers are a function of who they see the interviewer as and the situation in which the interview takes place. Interviews that take place in the workplace and give rise to different results from interviews that take place in the home. Interviews that take place in the bedroom will look very different from interviews that take place in the kitchen. So the point is, from the anthropological, ethnographic point of view, it is that you have to join people in their lives to study them. Point number 1 of the extended case method. And point number 2 is that you do this over time. You don't just join people in the village for 10 seconds, for 10 minutes, for 10 hours, for 10 days, but perhaps you might do it for 10 years. Well, very few people do it for 10 years. So, but a year, 2 years, 3 years, people actually spend time with the people they study. And every day, they write field notes. Every day. Has anybody done anything like this? Gentleman there, what have you done?
Also, I was researching the police force.
Police force?
Yes, actually, very difficult process during the police, especially the SWAT team. here, and I was doing a kind of research for, I think, it will be 10 years to.
How many?
Actually, 10 years.
10 years of fieldwork. Do they know that you're studying now?
Of course. Of course.
Of course. Ah, not of course. You say yes. Sometimes people, as I will tell you in a minute, sometimes people studying the world, they don't tell the people they're studying them. Oh, interesting. You might not think that is ethical. You should.
They know.
I can see they know. You're very sure about that. Very good. If you do it for 10 years, it would be very strange if they didn't know. But that's right. So what were you doing? You just sit and watch?
So actually, I was doing conducting interviews, but also I was to some extent participating in their activities when it was possible to participate as a person from outside Wrocław, as a civilian, not a member.
How did you give me an example of your participation?
So, for example, I was invited to training sessions.
Training sessions,
With the military, with the open police unit.
Ah.
So actually, I was immersed 24 hours.
So when the police come and repress demonstrators on the campus, are you there?
Actually, only one occasion the police came to the campus back to repress some nationalist folks.
And did you join them as a participant observer?
At that point, I was not at Wrocław.
Sorry?
At that point,
You were not here.
I wasn't here. But
Very convenient. The point is, very important point, being a participant observer is what we call it. Participating in the world you're studying can bring up all sorts of ethical problems, all sorts of conflicts and tensions. Whether you should totally identify with the police when they come and protest, when they come and repress the protest of your friends. What do you do? Interesting, very interesting. Well, lots of interesting questions. All right, we have a participant observer here, at least one. Very good. Very good, very good, very good. Anyway, the point is, you do the observations not for a few minutes or a few hours, but you do it for perhaps a year, 2 years, and at least several months. Anyway, this is not controversial. Oops, what's this? Thank you. So the extension of the micro to the macro. As I've already said, the Malinovskys of this world always did an isolated study. So did the Chicago School. The idea is to actually move from the micro processes to the macro forces. And that's the third point, but that's controversial. Still to this day, many people who do participant observation or are inclined to reduce the unit of analysis to the place that they study and not recognize the external factors. Yeah, so I've had a 40-year battle with ethnographers who want to always isolate their field sites. And I want to put it in its wider context, but to do that, you have to have the fourth point, which is the extend theory. Now, what does that mean? If you want to move from the micro and to figure out the forces at work, you have to know which forces to be looking at. That means you've got to have a framework that selects the appropriate forces. And I believe you cannot study the world without already having some presuppositions about that world, without having some questions about that world, without having some idea of how the world works, without, in other words, having already a theory. We all have theories. You have a theory that predicts, and you have a theory that nobody here will normally leave, and you'll all stay. And it becomes very interesting when somebody leaves. Perhaps the vice dean will suddenly leave, or she will get up and start yelling at me, and then you will wonder what's going on. Then we have to reconstruct our theory. And that is how theory develops. We discover exceptions to the theory, and then we have to rebuild the theory, to reconstruct the theory, to advance the theory, to extend the theory. And that is how I think. That is how I think of ethnography. You participate in the world, you study, you link the micro processes to the macro forces with the help of a theory that you develop and advance. It turns out that that is quite controversial. All right. Now I'm going to give you my example. How much time have I got?
It's alright.
20 minutes? 25?
25, half an hour.
Half an hour? Oh, this fellow is very generous. He's very kind. You can see on his face. Is he a very kind guy? Yes, I think that we all agree. Adam, you're a very kind guy. Alright, now. This is a story from Africa. It's when I was very young, like you. It was in 1968 that I went off to Africa, having just had a terrible experience as an undergraduate in the University of Cambridge in England, where I studied mathematics. I hated mathematics, I hated Cambridge, I hated England. I wanted to get as far away as possible, so off I went to Africa. Those were the days. Right, there is Africa. And in the end, I landed up in a place called Zambia. Now, Zambia was actually very focused. Its economy was very focused on copper. And you can see here the copper mines. There were 7 of them. And basically, Zambia had been a colony of the British Isles. It was a colony that, being so until 1964, and in 1964, as a result of struggles, it was given independence. And so it was now an independent country called Zambia before it was Northern Rhodesia. But Northern Rhodesia as a colony existed for one reason only as far as the British were concerned, that is because it produced copper. So the entire country was organized to facilitate the exploitation of copper with the help of labor, African labor. So here's Zambia and its copper industry. Let me tell you, British colony until 64, population 4 million. 2 multinational corporations controlled this copper industry, one of the biggest in the world. At that time, I think it was the 3rd biggest industry in the world, the copper industry. 50,000 employees, very importantly, 15% were white, the rest were black, mainly Zambians, but also Malawians and people from Zimbabwe. And what was important is that copper provided 90% of the foreign revenue of Zambia, 50 to 70% of the government revenue. So it was the key industry in Zambia. And at independence, listen to this, there were 1,200 people with secondary school certificates and only 100 who were graduates of the university. So the Zambian population, the African population, the black population was very undereducated. The colonial administration had not spent much time devoting itself to education. Okay, so I was interested in a question. I was interested in what happens to the racial order of colonialism in the post-colonial period. The racial order of colonialism was one defined by the color bar. What is the color bar? The color bar is the principle that no white should ever receive orders from a black. It basically is white over black. All authority is concentrated in white, and the subordinates are black. That is the color bar. And so this is what it looks like, white over black. And as I said before, 15% of the workers were white, and in those times they were on contracts from South Africa or from England or from Australia. They were on 3-year contracts, but they were the ones who were running the mines. They were the managers, they were the supervisors, they were the engineers, they were white and below were black. And my question was this: what happens to this color bar with independence? What happens to the racial order as Zambia becomes an independent, quote, independent country? The struggle for independence was the struggle to overthrow the colonial regime, to overthrow the racial order. So what happens to the racial order after 1964? Okay. The Zambian government, when I arrived in 1968, had just put out a report on Zambianization that suggested everything was going very fine. It suggested, excuse me, okay. It suggested that, here we see the number of expatriates, the number of whites is going down, beautiful, that's good. And the number of blacks is going up, also good. Number of Zambians in expatriate jobs. So that means that Zambia is moving up and whites are disappearing. Do you notice anything here? Sorry?
I think the numbers, they don't add up.
The numbers don't add up. What do you mean?
I mean, the proportion.
Sorry?
The number of the exported jobs, the whites leave, and there should be proportion of the Zambians who take over the jobs.
Right, so if you add it up, so very good, excellent. Yeah. Total number of jobs is actually increasing. So what is happening is whites disappearing. Still, the managerial order is becoming heavier and heavier and heavier. And so, I didn't realize that. Now, you're very clever, but I didn't realize that when I actually started the study. I was just curious. Well, it seemed to be going well, but what is actually happening? What does this show? That numbers do not reveal by themselves social processes. You have to go and observe social processes to understand them. But how are you going to observe the processes of Zambianization, the processes through which blacks take over white jobs? How are you going to do that? Because if I go to the mining companies and say, I want to study Zambianization, the change in the racial order, they will say, no way. We are not going to let you do that. We don't want anybody interfering with what's going on in our mining industry. They will not let you in and study it. It's too dangerous. To talk about race in post-colonial Zambia was suicidal. Nobody wanted to talk about such a sensitive topic as race in post-colonial Zambia. So I decided I would do covert participant observation. Covert, hidden, obscure. I would effectively become a spy. So I got a job in the industry because I was white. I had a degree from Cambridge, and they were looking for white employees. So they gave me a job in the personnel research unit. Now, I didn't know any sociology. I was a mathematician, but this was the very interesting place for me to do research. But I didn't tell anybody why I was going to be there. And besides, I needed the money. I was very poor, so they paid expatriates a lot of money. So I took the job, and then it turned out that the companies wanted to integrate the white wage structure with a black wage structure and make a single wage structure to deny there was any racial hierarchy. But they didn't know how to do it. It requires what is called a joint valuation scheme, evaluating jobs. And I will not tell you all the details of this, but it turned out that I was the only one with the expertise to understand how you could combine these two wage structures without changing the actual hierarchy of individuals in their existing payment. And it was a mathematical problem, or linear programming. I was the only one in the unit who understood it, so I had a lot of power, which gave me entry into all the sorts of things I wanted to know. And so they were very kind to me, and they said, well, you can do any research you want. So I said, well, I'm a sociologist, I want to be a sociologist, so I'll do a survey. And we did a survey on the mines, and the interviewers were the personnel officers, black. And the reason for me to do the survey was to find out about the conditions of workers, but really to talk to the interviewers about the processes of Zambionization. So it was a vehicle through which I could talk to people about the processes I was really interested in, but I was not telling anybody except the personnel officers what I was doing. Today that would not be possible, but we'll go into that later.
The method you don't like, it was service, but it was connected with interviews. But because I was doing this quite a long time, it appears in the end when I met the guy who was sitting in prison and he did research in this typically ethnological way because he was a prisoner. I got more or less the same data he got, and I was really surprised because that time I was thinking that I couldn't get the same data, so he must have had some information I would have approached to, for instance, like about raping or secret life of prisoners. But in fact, of course, he had some advantages because it was not true that every second prisoner was telling me about being raped. That was not the case. But more or less, I had very similar results. And I was really surprised because of that, I must say. And the second question is about Malinowski. I don't really understand why you say he was not making general theory, because he did. Although he wanted, maybe he didn't analyze the context you mentioned, but Poland is a country who was never a colonial country. So maybe we don't pay so much aspect to colonial perspective, but because he was analyzing the isolated community, you can assume that if you have possibility to reach the community which is isolated, and sometimes it happens, you can discover some universal law of the culture and society which govern in this community, and this was the case of Malinowski, I believe. But when he was studying the African culture, he also mentioned the influence of colonial and the urban changes and so on. So in terms of the theory, it was very general, because he wanted to explain the driving force of society. But because it's easier, everybody knows this, it's easier, at least in an assumption, to observe this in a small-scale society than a huge one. So maybe if you would focus on a society which is in the process of change, you would write a different theory maybe. But I would say that he was very global theory. So could you explain this? Why do you think he was very specific and not local, not global?
Yeah, they're all good points. Let's start with the Malinowski. I didn't intend to. I don't think I actually said that he didn't have theory. He definitively had theory. He had theory of small-scale interactions around, for example, trade, which became very influential. What he did not have was a theory of globalization, what we call globalization today, which world systems analysis, or even sort of there are political institutionalisms, people trying to figure out the relationships among nation states and how that affects the experience of people in different countries. I think that Zniewski and Thomas didn't have a theory of globalization, but they definitely did a study of globalization, looking at migration from both the standpoint of the sending community and the receiving community, and seeing how they were connected. If there was a theory, it was a theory of modernization. It was probably less explicit. I don't think there's any way in which any of these studies cannot have any theory. It's a matter of what sort of theory, what scale of theory, What is the object of theory? What is the question that the theory answers? So Malinowski, he would never have been the famous anthropologist that he was if he didn't have some theory, and if he did not actually create the foundations of what is really a functionalist view of society. So I think that we agree that Malinowski had theory, but he definitely didn't understand, he didn't attempt to even think about the ways in which broader forces were shaping his study in the Tobrine Islands, his classical studies. And which is fine, there is a powerful tradition of anthropology that emerged from his work. So that's the second question. The first question, yeah, I guess we probably have just a different, two aspects to this. First, I think we probably have a different philosophy of science. So I think you're speaking that basically that theory emerges out of collecting data, and that is a so-called positivist view of how science develops. I have a different view of science that emerges from more recent philosophy of science, that actually science develops through the progress of research programs. It's associated with people like Thomas Kuhn, most famously, but people like Imre Lakatos, who basically argue that we start with a theoretical framework and we build it. And in sociology, our theoretical frameworks to do with Marx, to Weber, to Durkheim. You can even say that Malinowski had his own theoretical framework, and Evans, Pritchard, and Fortis Brown pushed them forward. So basically, progress in science and social science, as much as physical science, develops on the foundations of an existing body of theory that we all somehow start from, agree with, or different bodies of theory that different groups of people agree with, and pushes it forward on the basis of anomalies and contradictions. So I think there are, from my experience, many places in the world, including the United States, and many people believe in the inductivist theory, that you collect the data and then you induce the theory. I am not of that view, and I don't see, and the history of science, the philosophy of science points to me that is not the way to think about science. Now, as regards the specific technique, yeah, I was probably unfair to interviewing. I suspect that you did your interview. How did you do your interviews?
What do you mean how?
Did you take prisoners in the prison? Presumably you interviewed them in the prison, or you took them outside?
If you are a prisoner, you are in prison.
Right, so that's very important. So that you were forced to actually interview people in their space and in their time. So you're almost an ethnographer. And if you interview people on a regular basis, the same into people, you are really basically, I would say, you're already an ethnographer. The very fact that you are actually studying prisoners means you have to study them in prison, in their place, in their life. Often when surveys are done, they are done in a context outside the normal space and time of the interviewee. When we think of social surveys, people are taken out of their normal lives and asked questions. And I think that people often, but there's a lot of evidence that then people actually respond to the situation in which they find themselves with the interviewer.
I understand that the point is that if you just do the research in a bad way, you are telling me, I interpret it in such a way, you are telling me about bad research, because I could make the short survey and just don't spend so much time in prison, and then the data will be very biased. But if you, the prisoner usually is afraid to tell you everything, right? So you have to spend more time, invest more effort to get the proper data. So I would never call this decent or not helpfully research, not the way you describe it. So,
well, I don't think I ever said that surveys were bad. I said that they produce data that is a function of the context. You were doing exactly what I was doing in the copper industry. I was also interviewing people. I was not telling them why I was interviewing them or talking to them. But that's precisely, I agree with you, exactly what you do is what I did in the copper industry. You were in prison and I was in the copper industry. And I think, that's the way that a systematic research involves actually talking to the same people over time, and I suspect that's what you were doing. So I don't think that there's any difference between us at all in that regard. I think we have a different philosophy of science, I agree there. And we have a different notions of what theory is. There's different scales of theory. There are different theories that apply to interaction, but there's also theory that applies to broader social forces. So I don't think that we disagree very much.
I would like to be interested in your opinion about a relatively recent trend in social sciences, which is somehow complementary to the traditional direction, which is sometimes related to what we call big data now. So big data, so where you ignore somehow a lot of the small size group complexity and just go for massive data which you gain from internet surveys, and then to try to see trends which probably with case studies are sometimes difficult to see. So I'm a physicist and a mathematician. I'm working a little bit on modeling this kind of processes as well, but I would be interested in your opinion how you see the value of this whole branch of interdisciplinary studies. It has even a name, social informatics, for instance, or sociophysics, which emerged over the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah, well, it is all the rage, all the fashion. Well, it certainly is in where I come from. And my university is investing a huge amount of money in big data analysis. And of course, one of the great potentialities of it is precisely its interdisciplinary character. As an ethnographer, I'm often skeptical of such data because it doesn't actually examine social processes. But such data is, I mean, today, it's impossible to do what used to be called survey research, telephone survey research. It's impossible to do that now because, people do not respond on the telephone anymore. They don't have the telephones. There's no way of organizing a representative sample. So survey research, as we used to do it, has gone. And one of the ways of replacing it is actually to use the sort of social media data and to collect the sort of data that Facebook offers us. And of course, Facebook, as we know, offers data to all sorts of companies and has, of course, used that data in ways that the people who produce the data were even unaware of. So there are ethical issues, but leaving those questions aside, I think that we are open to all sorts of new sources of data. Whether it generates any new ideas, I've yet to be convinced, and at least in the area of sociology. But many of my colleagues have no alternative but to actually try and elicit data. So some of them, for example, will actually, through Facebook, try and target, for example, employees of certain firms and ask people to have an interview. So basically they are using Facebook to actually make connections with people in, for example, Walmart. People have been trying to study Walmart. Walmart doesn't like to be studied, but lots of Walmart employees are on Facebook, and so they can gain access to those Walmart employees. And so they do studies that would otherwise not be possible. So yes, there are possibilities, but I think that a hell of a lot of resources are poured into this, and we've yet to see whether there will be fruitful material consequences and fruitful research. But it's definitely all the fashion, absolutely. And it's actually quite cheap research. You can actually do things quite cheaply, so that's another advantage. Survey research became more and more expensive, and this is actually quite cheap to actually use this data. So I think it's fascinating development anyhow, whatever the ultimate results are.
Thank you. More questions? I'm a student here, so I'm also a teacher. And I was very interested by a passing comment that you made at the beginning of the presentation about Zambia. That there was a very low percentage of Zambians who had any sort of education, and less so when it comes to a degree or university education. How do you think that affected, let's say, Zambians' capability in managing the research, especially when, let's say, it was completely nationalized? And to what extent did you put education as part of your research?
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, because one of the arguments of the mining companies was that we can't do Zambianization in any other way because we don't have the trained personnel, Zambian trained personnel. That's not actually true. Many of these positions didn't require high-level education. But what happened was a rapid expansion of the number of actual Zambians who had university degrees. What is interesting, actually, when we talked about I talked about the Zambianization of the personnel department, and what happened there is that, as I suggested, the whole department was Zambianized. So the white personnel manager became the staff advisor, staff development advisor, and then the black personnel manager was one from the old guard. He had been once upon a time a clerk who did some sort of translation, who knew English, but perhaps were not literate, and may not have had even a secondary school certificate, but still knew enough English to communicate. And then the senior personnel officer was similar, but then a new generation came in, even as I was there, who had much more higher levels of education. And there was a real tension, because these young people with much higher levels of education, probably not university education, but definitely secondary school education, they were very much opposed to the blockage of their supervisors, who they saw were really badly educated and were deficient in education. And so there was a real conflict between the newly educated and the old members that had been sort of recruited by the colonial administration. But yeah, you're right. I mean, obviously there were limits to Zambianization, but there were sufficient numbers that it could have been done in a different way. And that was my claim. The mining industry, in the beginning at any rate, denied that, but of course in the end they accepted the need to actually to think about actually dissolving the colour bar and allowing Zambians to promote it. For example, in Lusaka, in the capital of Zambia, the government itself was very rapidly Zambianized. They Zambianized not from the bottom but from the top. So the ministers were immediately Zambian, perhaps their immediate advisors were Zambian, and then there was an army of expatriates who did the advising. So education is important, but it's not the only factor at work here. But yes, that's a very important point. The shortage of educated Zambians, because of the legacy of colonialism, was limited. Yeah. Yes, Kalina, yeah.
I have a short question, because I really love the idea of extending in every kind of way in this case studies. And in relation to my previous study and maybe the one that I'm doing now, if you are thinking about ethnography, it's usually connotate that you are staying in one place and study the environment inside, but then you lose something around these external sources, processes, and so on. So when I was studying Sri Lanka and the reconciliation process, reconciliation after the war.
In Sri Lanka, you said?
Yeah, and my idea was that I have to cover free spaces like the cyberspace, because we had some kind of nationalism in this space that was really important in 2009. And then the international diaspora who were working in Netherlands, for example, that was my case, and then in physical space. And can I say, or can I think that this is my one extended case? And because I'm usually forced by teachers to narrow the study. And this is my problem. And for example, now, when I am studying solidarity with Palestine, I think that I cannot study just one group in one space. I need to cover many sources that have kind of a role in this. And is it methodological proper to think about it as an extended case study?
Yes, no, definitely. I mean, there is a concept that has become very popular in sociology called field. I mean, and that is precisely undefined. So in your case, your field will probably be a global field, and therefore if you are studying a global field, you study the different actors. The only problem is that when you start connecting those three places in a field, then you realize that there are other actors that you should also be studying. And so then there's a question as to what you do. So it's important to have, in my view, a theoretical framework that limits the number of fields that number of actors in the field that you will actually study. But yes, the whole point is in a global ethnography that you places and connect them. And we were talking about migration studies just a few minutes ago, and you should talk about your own study, because precisely, you know, the necessity. You can't study migrants in Eastern Europe without studying the institutions in which they're incorporated in the city. You can't do that without studying the relationship of the city to the state, and then you can't study these migrants without looking at where they come from. And so what we're doing, we're going back to Znanetsky and Thomas, right? So basically, to their whole idea that you do something, that you do ethnography of a transnational character, and you have to look at both ends of the migration stream. The same thing if you're looking at Palestinian solidarity movements, they look very different in different places. And it's important to think about that.
Because you said that you, after your research, you found out that the state plays a really important role in the whole process. And then what you did? I mean, because you just finished your research, so you had some kind of assumptions, everything that you were writing in your book. And what then?
Well, what I should have done is rewrite the book, right?
Yeah.
And it's endless. Well, yeah, I didn't. I didn't at the time. I didn't even realize that the significance of. At the time, I see it now, but I didn't realize the significance of the way in which it got published was actually affected the theory that I was trying to develop. But yes, in principle, I should. And I think that's what we do. We are continually rewriting studies. Anthropologists usually do one big fieldwork. Perhaps they do two, perhaps they do three, but usually one big one, and they basically rewrite that fieldwork as their career over time. Max Gluckman, who was one who most influenced me, he basically did two sets of fieldwork, but was continually rewriting and re-understanding. Well, and in my life too, I did the most, I suppose not the most important, but the study that I'm most well known for is a study of a factory in South Chicago. I revisited somebody else's study 40 years before, 30 years before, and basically for the rest of my life I've been rewriting it. So nothing is a finished product.